Welcome to our wildlife habitat program, and maybe I could, here we go. And so we are we do programs the third Wednesday of the month, and we do them either by Zoom or in person. We kind of go, especially in the winter, with the speaker's choice. So here we go. I'm not haven't done this in a while. I forget how to turn the pages. Anyway, so the Camano Wildlife Habitat Project is to kind of prevent all the habitat loss that's going on in Camano and beyond. So the National Wildlife Federation certifies yards as backyard wildlife habitats, and they also certify communities. So Camano is a community wildlife habitat because we have a lot of people certifying their yards, providing food, water, shelter, and places to raise young. And what we're hoping is to restore some corridors. So if we get people to leave their native plants on Camano or restore places where the plants are gone, then we can restore corridors and link up our backyards with the parks. So it's not hard to do, and it's not something you do all at once. So here is my yard. We moved here in on Veterans Day 1994. And so that's what our yard looked like in the top part. So I live on the water down below, and our house and our garage is on the hill, and we have a strip of land. And so there was a tall tree and grass. And then we started to plant for wildlife. So the snow is 1990, like January 1995, and then we started on the left side, so which is the south side, and so we started to do that, and you can see in 2007 that the south side of our yard is pretty. There's a lot of good vegetation there, and the right side, the north side, we're just starting to work on that. So we're thinking when we're planning about layers. So I have ground cover, shrubs, and trees. And so, and because that's what's going to work really nicely for the wildlife versus just grass and a tree. That's a real sterile environment. So now, currently, you can see that we've got our ground covers and we've got our shrubs and shorter trees and really tall trees. And it's quite an oasis on a hot, sunny day. Our neighbors on both sides, they still have grass and a couple of trees, tall, and it's really hot on their side. But we've got this wonderful oasis, and it has lots of cover and things for the birds and the critters to eat. So, but we did it, we didn't do it all at once. It takes, you do it in pieces with these things in mind. So providing food, water, shelter, and places to raise young. The food, the shelter, and the places to raise young, you can do that with pretty much with the plants. Even the water, like on one of our garden tours, I saw a little frog and a great big leaf. And so there was a little bitty puddle and where the leaf kind of came together, where the stem came up, and the frog was right next to this little pool on the leaf. Logs, I just realized nurse logs, they're saturated with water, and those are good water sources for insects. So a lot of things that we're planting and using as plants also are helping with the water too. So there's the things to think about, especially living, on an island, then everything we do runs into the sound. So, reducing lawn, growing natives, water conservation, all those are really things to think about living on an island. Um, you, when you fill out the application to be a certified backyard wildlife, it'll talk about, pesticides and fertilizer and stuff. And we don't expect everyone to be purists all at once. But, as a backyard wildlife habitat is a work in progress. And as you start doing more things in your yard and you see more critters and more birds and whatnot and are enjoying it, I know I've become more conscientious of the things that I do in my yard. So another thing that isn't on here is the leaves. So the leaves that you have in your yard right now, they're all providing nutrients for your trees. And so rather than raking, we are advocating keeping the leaves. And not only are they helping the trees, and such. They're also helping the birds and the critters that kind of have they're able to get little insects and various things underneath the leaf debris. And in our yard, it's like we've got this wonderful ground cover. The leaves, the big, the big leaf maple leaves, those huge things, they're all covering the yard. And every spring, our ground cover just flourishes and looks bright and green with little white flowers. And the leaves have disappeared. So with no raking. So we're advocating keeping the leaves because that's good for the environment and the critters. The other thing is, excuse me, um, what we do in our backyard can go beyond just our own backyard. It's kind of like a community thing. This is our action step on Camano, and then it's an action step in many communities around the nation. 18 in Washington and 180 in the nation have been certified as community wildlife habitats. So it's an action step on how we can link yards. In fact, there's a guy, Douglas Tallamy, he wrote a book called Nature's Best Hope. And that book is about a homegrown national park, which is all of us who are doing backyard wildlife habitats. We're all part of this national homegrown park, because this is what we can do in our yards, and this is how we can make a difference. And it does make a difference. So I highly advocate becoming one of a backyard wildlife habitat. Easy to do. There's an application. You can get the application on our website, or you can go directly to National Wildlife Federation .org to get an app to fill out the application online. And it's just providing information, checking it off on how you provide food, water, shelter, places to raise young, and doing sustainable gardening practices, which is you only need a couple of things in each section. And so you can see that it's a work in progress. You don't have to be a purist and have it all checked out. You grow as you have your wildlife habitat. And if you put up a sign, then you can have well, if your garden looks a little messy, it's showing it's purposeful. So a sign and some yard art, no one can complain. So on Camano, we have 10,000, well, not 10,000, 1,079 certified habitats working on 1,100. And you can see it's all spread out throughout the island. So we're linking up parks, hopefully, and our protected spaces are linked up with what we're doing with our yards as well. These are the areas in Washington State. So we're kind of like a certified region for the National Wildlife Federation. And both the National Wildlife Federation has a terrific website to find out more. And Roxy has done a phenomenal job with our wildlife habitat Camano website. You can go and see old recordings of our past Zooms. So it's like this library of information. We've got PDFs and handouts from the various speakers online there. You can apply as a backyard wildlife and get the application there. So it's full of great information. You get a native plant list, and that native plant list works really well with the catalog that the Snohomish Conservation District has for their sale that they do each year. And that shows, how you can plant with layers, and sunny, moist, wide, narrow. So it's a wealth of information, both websites. And these are great references as well. Living with Wildlife and Landscaping for Wildlife are written by a wildlife biologist from the state, Russell Link. He lives over in Whidbey. And so it's great because it's really specific for the Pacific Northwest. And then the Wildlife Federation has a book that they publish as well that's excellent too. That's more East Coast than the other two. And with that, I can introduce Paisley. So here's my stop share. Okay, and then let me just look at my notes because there's scads of information. So Paisley Blume, she's a habitat restoration and forestry technician for the Snohomish Conservation District. She has a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science and Resource Management from University of Washington. And while there, she worked for the at the UW's Native Plant Nursery, and she did undergraduate research with Professor, I'm not sure how to say his name, Effie F.
It's
I can't,
Edel.
Edel.
Yeah.
Man, how did I'm not even close in what I
No
wrote.
worries, no worries.
I apologize to him and to you. And they were looking at the variable density in planting. And Paisley's also worked with methods to mitigate broom growth in on the Olympic Peninsula, and probably tons of other stuff as well. So um, many thanks, Paisley, for coming and speaking again for us, and welcome, Paisley Bloom from Snohomish Conservation District.
Thank you so much, Val, for that intro. I'm just gonna get my slides pulled up just for a moment.
Paisley, you're muted. Sorry.
Oh gosh, my apologies.
Did I hit
Thank
that?
you. I'm not sure, but if as long as I'm unmuted now.
Okay, yes, you're unmuted. So, but you'll have to start again, please.
Okay, no worries. Well, good evening to everybody, and thank you so much for being here. And Val, thank you so much for that amazing introduction. It was really exciting seeing that map of almost 1,100 folks that are officially, certified in this program. That's really cool to see. And thank you to everyone who's here online tonight. I'm super excited to be here with all of you to discuss one of my most favorite topics, which is how to incorporate features like native plants into your yard and create wildlife habitat. Like Val mentioned, my name is Paisley Bloom, and I'm a habitat restoration and forestry technician here at the Snohomish Conservation District. And the title of my presentation tonight is My Garden Brings All the Birds to My Yard. And we will definitely talk about birds in this presentation, but also many other types of wildlife to attract to your yard. And I wish I could take credit for this very cool title, but it actually came from my very creative bird-loving coworker, Sarah Rosero, who has, I think, also presented for this organization as well in the past. So have to give her a little shout out for the creativity. And I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit more. Like Val mentioned, I graduated from UW in 2024 with a degree in environmental science and resource management. And I had a particular focus on forestry and also restoration work. And I did work at the UW Native Plant Nursery. In general, I really love to garden and working with native plants and figuring out unique ways to sort of incorporate them into our environment and then think about all the other sort of ecological benefits that is having. I've been at the Snohomish Conservation District since 2024, working on our habitat restoration and forestry team. A little bit about my role. I'm a project manager, so I have a couple restoration sites that I manage. I also manage our native plant nursery and I lead our wildfire resiliency program. And I also support our annual plant sale, which I will talk about tonight. Very exciting. And then I also do outreach events like this one. And these are always a really fun opportunity to connect with folks and talk about amazing topics, spread knowledge, and I just get to chat about things that I'm very passionate about. So I feel very lucky to be here tonight. Overall, I really just love thinking about ways to incorporate native plants into our landscapes and thinking about how that connects and supports wildlife. And so I love to spend time outside, hiking, being on the water, making observations about our natural world. And I'm just super excited to share some of this information tonight with all of you. To give you a bit of a preview for the evening, I'm going to start just to introduce the Snohomish Conservation District, talk a little bit about what we do and our role in our community. And then we're really going to get into the bulk of the presentation, talking about native plants, their benefits, why to use them, going over some ecology, and then I'm going to provide you with a whole bunch of plant options to potentially incorporate into your yard. And then we'll really root ourselves in the foundation of how to create habitat for pollinators and wildlife. And at the end of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about some resources and highlight some information about our annual plant sale coming up in 2026. And I know we have time for questions at the end, but feel free to use that chat function. I really love to have interaction during these webinars. So if you have questions that come up, or if you'd like to share stories. I might even ask for a little bit of participation through the chat this evening. So be brave and feel free to speak up as you're inspired. So jumping in, what is a conservation district? We are a non-regulatory agency, so very similar actually to a fire district, but we are focused on the conservation of natural resources. And we sort of, as an agency, started during the 1930s as a result of the Dust Bowl sort of era, and there was sort of this larger need in recognizing that we needed more focus on how to conserve soil and water. And so conservation districts formed out of that. There are around 3,000 in the US and 45 in Washington, Snohomish being one of them. And at the district here, we serve both Snohomish County and Camano Island. We provide free technical assistance and financial assistance to land managers in both Snohomish County and Camano Island, and we really diversify who we work with from folks who are in more rural and urban areas and also suburban as well to really improve habitat, soil health, productivity, resiliency, and water quality through implementing best management practices. We have a variety of teams at the district. Our agriculture team is very focused on agricultural resiliency and focuses on topics like pasture, weeds, muds, and manure management, as well as soil health. We also have a community conservation team that really works more so with urban and suburban residents, thinking about things like rain gardens, cisterns, and bioswales. We also have our habitat restoration team, which is what I am on, and we are very focused, of course, on habitat restoration and in areas of riparian areas as well as working buffers. And then we also have a forestry program in which we work a lot with small forest landowners, helping provide them resources and creating sustainable long-term plans. And then we also have a youth and education program and team as well. And that's sort of one of the reasons I get to be here tonight. Switching gears a little bit to really jump into the topic for the evening. I always love to start with just defining native plants and thinking about why we would want to incorporate them into our landscapes. And one of my favorite definitions of native plants is that they are ones that have evolved and adapted to our local environment for thousands of years, and they're a very important part of our local habitats, ecosystems, and they provide ecosystem services such as facilitating pollination, infiltration, carbon sequestration, and much more. And that they are also some of the most sustainable plants for our very specific area and region. So native plants are not only adapted physically, but also chemically and genetically to thrive in this specific environment. One of the biggest benefits to planting native species is that they're already adapted to our local conditions, meaning our climate, our rainfall patterns, and our soil types here in Washington. So these plants have, again, evolved over many, many thousands of years even to thrive in our very specific amount of moisture, sun, and nutrients that are available in this area. And because of that, they typically don't require things like fertilizer or irrigation once they're established. Usually, this can take 1 to 2 growing seasons, but overall, in the long run, these really do make them a lot more on the low maintenance side of the spectrum because they really are more resilient during periods of hot and dry summers, which can be, increasingly common with sort of what we're facing with climate change. But again, it's really great to think about how you might be able to lessen sort of the water consumption and also the amount of fertilizers and pesticides you're using because these native plants really do have that natural ability to resist things like native pests and diseases and that are adapted to our environment. Another huge benefit of native plants is to wildlife, of course. And that is because native plants are really the foundation of our local food webs. And they have evolved alongside native insects, birds, and mammals to provide the right kinds of nectar, seeds, fruits, and shelters that wildlife need to survive year round. And that idea of year round is very important, and we'll dive into that a little bit more in a couple slides. One example of this is just that native flowering plants really support native bees and butterflies by blooming at sort of the right time for pollination. Um, I like to think about salmonberry and serviceberry as great species that are providing food for things like birds and small mammals. But then they're also providing structural elements as well, sort of in this middle layer of the canopy, offering resources for things like nesting and cover throughout all the seasons. And To tie this into a little bit of the conservation lens of things as well, I always like to mention that native plants are really wonderful at improving water quality because of their infiltration uh, uh, qualities. So native plants definitely have fibrous root systems, and they're really excellent at filtering out those pollutants to improve water quality. At the district here, a really significant part of our funding comes from salmon recovery. And so when we think about the interactions between water and pollutants and how that's interconnected to our waterways, especially being on Camano Island, thinking about how things are flowing into the Puget Sound, incorporating more native plants is a really great way to improve water quality for these endangered and threatened species like salmon. This is something a newer study that I found. A colleague shared this with me, and I thought maybe you would all would find it interesting. This is a study that came out of North Carolina looking at the North Carolina chickadee. During their breeding season, they were really investigating sort of the distribution of native plants to non-native plants in different environments and seeing how that impacted the chickadees' reproduction and also just their mortality and general life cycle, and just really looking at those interactions. And the conclusions of that study actually found that having a 70% minimum amount of native plants really provided a great benefit to these species, both in providing food, so things like fruit, and then also the insects that are living on those plants, but also the cover and shelter. Um, and I really like to think about this 70-30% rule when I also talk about how to incorporate native plants into a landscape. Because, like Val mentioned, it doesn't have to be something that you're doing all at once. You can sort of grow to create wildlife habitat. But I think that 70% minimum is a really great place to shoot for in the beginning, especially if you have a lot of non-natives in your yard. You don't need to get to 100% right away. You can sort of take it in incremental steps. And this here, linked below, is just the article that you can read for the Smithsonian Magazine, if anyone is interested in taking a closer look. As many of you, I'm sure know, I'm sure we have a lot of gardeners in the audience tonight, but it's a really important concept when you're thinking about incorporating native plants is picking the right plant for the right spot. So environmental factors will really influence the establishment, the success, and then also the survival rate of your plants. So some of the main things to think about is your soil type, your sunlight availability, your water availability, and then also if there are any other sort of environmental factors. So that could be if you live right on the coast, that might be salt or wind spray. If you've noticed potentially, I like to think about Western hemlock. We have a lot of root rot on the west side of the Cascades here. And so if you're noticing your Western hemlocks are really breaking a lot, maybe you have pockets of root rot on your property and you might want to choose a plant like Western red cedar to replace that conifer because it is more resilient to that natural or rather native root rot. These two images on this slide come from King County. They have these amazing native plant guides that I highly recommend checking out. They really do a great job of showing you how to both layer your canopy and also spacing your plants in very creative ways for very specific conditions. So if you go to King County's website to check these out, you can actually select planting guides based off of the conditions in your yard. So things like sunny and dry, or shady and moist, or sunny and moist. So there's a huge variety of different guides that you can explore to maybe give you some guidance. And as you are making these choices about purchasing plants and then thinking about where to put them, I always really encourage people to consider what are your conditions and what is already thriving in your yard versus what is not thriving. And definitely consider assessing all of these different factors throughout the seasons, but especially in the winter and the summer, because these are going to be sort of your high and your low points of specifically sunlight and water availability. So it is a bit of a seasonal process, and just taking the time to sort of observe what's happening in your yard, and what these conditions are. So I've already touched on this a little bit, but it really is all about timing when it comes to native plants. So native plants have evolved very specific patterns that are adapted to their local environment, and each species has a very specific timing for growth, flowering, seed dispersal, and dormancy. And so what I really want to highlight here is some of those pattern differences between natives and non-natives, especially in relation to wildlife. So the main thing here is that native plants really have this synchronized this synchronized ability, if you will, with our native wildlife and specifically pollinators, where they're coupled together. So our native species are blooming and providing the resources that our pollinators need when they need it, so at a very specific time. Compared to non-natives and ornamentals, there tends to be a bit of a mismatch between these species and our native pollinators, and so that can lead to sort of less useful resources over time. And when we're thinking about how to sort of diversify in our own yard, it's really great to think about this idea of year-round resources. So not just thinking about sort of the boom bust cycle that you might experience with some non-natives and ornamentals, where you have beautiful flowers and fruiting during the summer, but our native species can actually offer resources throughout the entire year. So this is just a bit of a chronology of some of my favorite species that I like to highlight through different seasons. During the springtime, osoberry, which is sort of in the bottom left here. One of my most favorite species is sort of, to me, an indicator that spring is here. It's one of the first species to sort of break bud. You see these beautiful green, lime green leaves pop out, and it's really supporting some of those early season pollinators that really, they've been dormant during the winter and they are awake and they are hungry and they're ready to go. And these osa berries are providing great resources for them. We also have Oregon grape. They get these beautiful yellow flowers. They are also some of the more early season bloomers. And then we move into summer. This is definitely when we have a super peak when it comes to our flowering species. I love to highlight Ribes sanguineum, our red flowering currant, because it's one of my favorites. It's also a species that really supports hummingbirds for those bird lovers out there. We also have some lower growing species such as Oregon iris and also riverbank lupin. These are also just wonderful species to support pollinators. Moving into the fall, we see species like twinberry that is starting to form fruit for some of those late summer, early fall food needs. And then really Canadian goldenrod is an absolute superstar when it comes to being a great supporter of pollinators, but also being a late bloomer. So goldenrod is, I think, one of our latest blooming species for flowers. So that's really a great species to incorporate if you're a pollinator lover and you want to get some more flowering plants that are going to continue to flower later into the season. And then I love to highlight kinnikinick and snowberry as two really great, sort of what are called famine foods, is like a term, but really what that means is that these species actually retain their berries throughout the winter. And so specifically birds, I know sparrows, for example, really will be attracted to these plants and use them and eat them during the winter months. So they're really great. It's almost like food reserve for a lot of species. And I would love if anyone has any favorite early season bloomers or late season bloomers, sort of on both ends of the spectrum. If you'd like to drop them in the chat, I'm always looking for more plants to talk about when I'm thinking about year-round resources and how to incorporate them into people's yards. Another great thing about year-round resources is it's not just for wildlife, but it can also be for you. So I like to think that it actually adds so much more variety to your yard so that throughout the seasons you also get to enjoy sort of the natural beauty and see how your yard is changing throughout the year. I think is a really beautiful process. So great for wildlife and also lovely and aesthetically pleasing. Jumping right into talking about some pollinators, I will definitely highlight a lot of different wildlife, but I think most people are very interested in pollinators. And I just want to introduce some of the key players. So, of course, we have bees. We have our mining and sweat bees, also leafcutter and cellophane bees as well. One of my favorite things is, especially on sort of a dewy, cold morning, is finding a male cellophane bee sleeping like in a flower. It's just such a special thing to find. So, by having more of those plants that are specifically flowers that are available for those bees, maybe you can also catch a glimpse of some of that natural beauty. We also have many butterflies, for example, wood skippers, painted ladies, swallowtails. Something I always like to point out for butterflies is to remember they do have two life stages. So we have, of course, their mature butterfly stage, but also the caterpillar stage. So it's really great if you are noticing caterpillars in your yard to really look up, you know, is this eventually going to turn into a butterfly that is going to be a pollinator for me, or is this sort of a pest problem? So investigating those caterpillars before you squish them right away. We also have birds. Hummingbirds and honey eaters are two great examples of pollinating birds. One that is always, I think, forgotten is bats. We have our desert bats that are pollinators, which is super exciting. And then there's sort of the other category of beetles, flies, ants, wasps. So we have this huge, abundance and really diverse set of pollinators in Washington, but especially in Western Washington. So it's really exciting that we get to talk about how to support them. And of course, I think we all know pollinators are super important, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about it a little bit. Of course, pollinators are supporting plant reproduction, and they are the drivers of this reproduction. And they're really acting as couriers to move pollen from the anther to the stigma of different individuals, which can lead to a higher level of genetic diversity. And this creates more resiliency in our plant population. So that means that these plants are better able to resist things like diseases and pests and also changes to our environment. And that movement is especially important in natural systems where things like wind or water might not be enough to move pollen between individual flowers. Something else to consider with pollinators is that they are very supportive of our human food systems as well. Um, One quote that I pulled from the Food and Agricultural Organization is that actually 30% of our food is very dependent on pollination, and this includes wild pollinators. So pollinators are supporting a huge variety of crops, things like apples, berries, squash, almonds, tomatoes, and many more. And so without this pollination, we'd see a huge decrease in sort of our crop yields, but also a rise in food prices, and then also just a general decline in nutrition as well. And on a small scale, pollinators can support also your fruit and vegetable gardens at home, which is really great. And aside from our human food systems, they are also really providing food and habitat availability for other species as well. So one quote or statistic rather, that I always like to pull is that 85% of our flowering plants are pollinator dependent, meaning that without pollinators, they would be unable to reproduce. So, really a huge driver in biodiversity, and so very important to support them. One of the simplest and exciting ways that you can support pollinators is by creating a pollinator meadow. So, a pollinator meadow is a naturally managed or intentionally planted area that's designed to support pollinators like those bees, butterflies, and other insects. And these meadows are typically sort of a mix of native wildflower flowers and also grasses, and they can provide things like food, but also shelter for those pollinators as well. Um, Meadows are actually a really important also just feature of our land, and we have really seen a huge loss in meadow space, mainly due to urbanization. So this is a really great feature to add to your yard, and then again, supporting other healthy ecosystems and biodiversity as well. You can do this in a relatively small area, which is also pretty cool. And in that small area, you can really support a huge abundance of biodiversity, both when you think about plants, but also the pollinators and other wildlife. So in a pretty small area, you can pack in a lot of stuff, which is pretty cool. I always like to point out as well that these are really pretty low maintenance. Most people are installing pollinator meadows with native seed packs, and I really recommend checking out Northwest Meadowscapes. They're a great resource. You can purchase native seed packs there, but they also have great articles just diving a little bit deeper into pollinator meadows and thinking about those benefits. Typically, in these seed packs, I'd also like to mention that a lot of these species are going to be more sun-loving, and there's a mix typically of annuals and perennials. And one great benefit about pollinator meadows is that it really decreases the amount of mowing that you have to do. Um, Typically, people are mowing maybe once a year, but I also know people that never mow and just allow things to self-seed, which is really exciting. And there's really not a huge water or fertilizer need. Typically, when you're first getting them established, it's great to water them just to support germination. But once your pollinator meadow is established, it's pretty self-sustaining. Shifting gears a little bit, but still holding on to this thread of wildlife and habitat. Um, Val mentioned this a little bit, but I really want to dive a little bit more into the need of connectivity for wildlife. So, wildlife does move both daily and seasonally in order to survive, and that involves moving in order to find things like food and water and shelter, and then also seasonally to breed or overwinter. And so, when habitat becomes really patchy or isolated, these sort of natural movements just break down, and that can lead to declines in population, in health, and genetic diversity, and then also just generally survival rates. I think that and on Camano Island, I've sort of tried to highlight this here a little bit with these orange circles on the screen, is that as we're seeing a higher level of things like development for both housing, driveways, commercial areas, and then also highly landscaped yards, even as well, yards that are primarily grass, for example, these aren't really supporting wildlife in the way that a more natural area would. And so wildlife that once moved freely is now facing a lot more barriers, and it can be even unsafe for them and lead to higher levels of mortality. And definitely, this is a regional issue, but it's also widespread as well. There was a really interesting USGS survey that came out a while ago, but it was talking about the Puget Sound and sort of this reduced ecological resiliency, and that around 70% of our historic estuarine and delta habitat is now completely gone due to urbanization. So thinking about how we can support wildlife on a small scale is really great. And by connecting these landscapes, we can support healthier wildlife populations, safer animal movement, and then also long-term ecosystem stability. And now getting into sort of how we can create that habitat, I like to think about this on two sort of different scales. So we have this larger sort of large transitions between huge green spaces. And so that might be something like a wildlife bridge. I have the I-90 wildlife bridge pictured here, which is sort of connecting two really large green spaces. But sort of the purpose of this presentation is really to focus on how we are creating sort of these stepstones for wildlife and connecting larger areas and smaller areas of green spaces so that wildlife can move more freely and access the resources that they need throughout all of their different life cycles. And gardens and green spaces are just a great way to create that connectivity. And I think the map that Val shared in the beginning of seeing all of the different, backyard wildlife certification properties and seeing how they're overlapping and touching and connecting with other green spaces is a really beautiful example of how you can create that connectivity and how even doing it in a small space can have sort of that ripple effect out. Thinking about what wildlife needs, this has been covered a little bit, but the main four things that wildlife need in order to survive is food, water, cover, and safety. And safety being specifically a place to raise young. Something I always like to encourage folks to do is to think about the question of who are you trying to attract, because that will really guide your decisions in terms of what species you want to purchase and incorporate into your yard. And also even outside of native plants, but also the features that you want to incorporate. So I have shown here, for example, sort of a bit of a brush pile with some rocks and logs. And if you are someone who really loves amphibians, you might want to incorporate some of these moist, shady spaces for those amphibians to hide under and get the moisture that they need. But if you are really interested maybe in cavity nesters like a pileated woodpecker or many of our owl species, maybe you will incorporate leaving more standing dead wood for them to nest in. And so really just thinking about what are your goals for your property, who are you trying to attract is really going to drive you in a very specific direction when you're making choices about what features to incorporate into your yard. The next sort of set of slides that I have are all going to be plant suggestions, plants that are very specifically focused on creating that food resource for a lot of our wildlife and pollinators included in that. So if you have the screenshot function ready or you're a fast writer, get ready to take some notes. So I always like to start by just talking about what are the food resources that plants can provide. So of course we have things like seeds, berries, pollen, sap, nectar, and then insects is one that I think often gets missed. But because we're creating space for those insects to breed, to live, that also means that then that becomes a resource for other wildlife who rely on those insects for food as well. So I like to include that as a food resource. So my first species for you all is red flowering currant, one of my favorite. It's especially great for hummingbirds, like I mentioned, and it gets these lovely pink flowers that are sort of a tubular shape. They are really going to love to be in full sun and part shade, and can really tolerate sort of a variety of soils, soil texture and moisture as well. Next, we have two evergreen shrubs. The first is salal. Salal is, again, a very versatile species that produces some edible berries. And they have sort of these beautiful cone-shaped flowers, or maybe urn-shaped flowers rather, that bees will often, I'll find them sort of rustling around in there. And they also have really interesting soil properties as well. So the Ericaceae family has these very interesting mycorrhizal connections, so there's a great improvement to soil health by incorporating salal into your yard. We also have Oregon grape. There's both sort of the short Oregon grape, but we also have tall Oregon grape as well. I really like to point this one out because it is such a great alternative to the non-native species common holly. It has a very similar look in terms of its leaf, but again, is a native species that is has these beautiful yellow flowers and also these edible berries. So providing some more of those food resources compared to the alternative holly.
Paisley, we have a question in the chat about whether the
Hmm.
plants are deer resistant. So as you go through, maybe you might
Oh,
add a
absolutely.
note about that.
Yeah, I would be happy to talk about that. I would say Oregon grape is going to be one that's a bit more deer resistant. If you can see sort of in the photo, it has these sort of sharp edges. If you've ever encountered one, they actually kind of hurt if you brush up against it. They are a bit spiky. So that is a species that will be a bit more deer resistant. My next two are going to be sort of, they're trees, but they'll stay on the smaller side. Both are chokecherry and then also Pacific crabapple. They both get these really lovely white flowers, and they prefer to grow in sort of full sun and can tolerate a little bit of shade and can definitely tolerate some moist soil. They are really great food resources for birds. They both produce a cherry and then of course an apple, as the name suggests. So really great food resource. I would say not so deer resistant. Deers will definitely munch on these for sure because they are tasty. I always like to spotlight roses. We have a variety of native roses. Just to name a three, we have the bald hip, nuka, and cluster rose. These would be more on the deer resistant side because again, they do have those spikes, so that natural physical barrier. They are all the roses that we have are going to grow in full to partial sun and prefer moist soils, but they are very versatile. Something I really love about roses is that they're thicket forming. So if you're really interested in incorporating something like a hedgerow on your property, these are great species to incorporate. And then they also produce rose hips, which are a really excellent food resource, and specifically, they're very high in vitamin C. So great for birds, insects, and pollinators. My next three species are sort of thinking about that lower area of your canopy, so ground cover specifically. Sedum is a really cool genus. I just highlighted Oregon stonecrop here, but sedum and stonecrop is a specific genus, and there's a few different species within that, but they're very drought tolerant and they spread so easily. I think you just a drop of water on these roots and they will propagate. So this is a great ground cover that can spread pretty rapidly, which is pretty cool. And they're really get these awesome flowers, and they sort of will shoot up out of these more like succulent clusters here. And so they're really great for attracting pollinators and have a very like unique look to them. And they can also grow in pretty tough environments as well. So I will sometimes see them like growing in people's driveways, like over rocks. So very versatile species, and great ground cover. Blue-eyed grass gets these beautiful purple flowers. They are a great species if you're trying to transition away from traditional lawns while also attracting pollinators. And then kinnikinick is one that I already chatted about a little bit. Really great for a winter food resource. It is also a evergreen species and pretty versatile, where it will grow in full to partial sun and can tolerate sort of a variety of soils as well. Next, I just wanted to highlight some more of the wildflower type species. We have Pearly Everlasting and Big Leaf Lupin. Also, Riverbank Lupin is another one that's very similar. These are ones that you will often find in native seed packs. They are really going to like full sun, and they can tolerate some of that drier soil. And pollinators are a huge fan of them. And lupin is apparently deer resistant. Um, I'm not really sure to the extent of the efficacy of like the research behind it being deer resistant, but this is something that is sort of, discussed amongst groups of people who talk about native plants a lot, that lupin, both big leaf and riverbank, are more deer resistant compared to other flowers. Um, and these are also really great alternative to the non-native species foxglove. Pacific bleeding heart is a flowering understory species that I love to highlight for folks who have really shady yards. And they have a really unique flower shape, and they're really great to support pollinators. And specifically, there's certain types of butterfly larvae that will munch on this foliage. So that's a really great thing to incorporate if you're okay with a little bit of caterpillar munching. And then because they are growing in sort of these more shady environments, they provide really great cover for amphibians. I always like to also highlight asters and goldenrod. These are absolute superstars when it comes to supporting pollinators. There's some really interesting research that actually the contrast of the purple and yellow flowers actually attracts pollinators even more. So it really becomes this beacon for bees, and that they're receiving more pollinator visits when planted together than when they're planted apart. So that's pretty cool. These are also species that are very much available in lots of seed packets, and we will be offering goldenrod at our plant sale this year as well. So shifting away a little bit from native plants for a moment, I want to dive into some more characteristics of features that you can incorporate into your yard for wildlife. So cover and safety, we've sort of touched on this a little bit, and these are just a few examples of how you can incorporate that. So we have roosting boxes and platforms. This also includes things like bat boxes as well. You can also create insects hotels. These three pictures, I think at the bottom, really illustrate that you can go, you know, you just have to choose your own adventure in a way. You can go really simple. You can use a tin can and throw some sticks in there and it's going to create some habitat. You can go a little more fancy and create something that is a more contained box. Or my personal favorite is creating an awesome brush pile where insects can just make their nests and do their thing, and be safe and have the resources of both food, but also the cover and safety that they need. Bunch grasses are another really great thing to incorporate. And woody debris, we've already sort of touched on, and I'll talk about a little bit more in terms of the types of woody debris that we have. So there are these sort of on the ground things like nurse logs that can support amphibians, and then also species growing on top of those nurse logs. We have these brush piles, which is just piling that woody debris, creating shelter. But then we also have standing dead trees, which are really great for, like I mentioned, cavity nesters. So there's sort of a lot of different types of debris that you can incorporate into your space. Moving into talking a bit more about layered canopies, these is a really important concept when it comes to planting with native species, because a lot of studies actually show that plant communities will increase biodiversity and create more self-sustaining systems when you are filling sort of the different layers of your canopy. So from ground cover to mid-story, intermediate, all the way to your overstory. So thinking about all the different layers and how you can sort of create resources in each layer. And then they will sustain themselves much better, so that you won't need to rely on things like fertilizer or irrigation to sustain your garden. They'll sort of create a network underground in the soil to support one another. Um, Another great thing maybe for gardeners as well, and as you get to enjoy your yard, is that it creates more year-round beauty by having more diversity. I really love this picture here with the red flowering currant in the front, and in the back is a Pacific madrone, which is an evergreen tree and has this beautiful like red peeling bark. So like as this, this very vibrant red flowering currant sort of dies back during the winter, you still get this like pop of color behind it. So that's just a way to incorporate some of that aesthetic beauty into your yard. I always get a lot of questions about shade tolerant species, because I think a lot of people, maybe you have some mature trees, or maybe your house is in a position that's blocking a lot of your yard, so you don't get a lot of sunlight. So I always like to highlight a few of my favorite shade tolerant species. On the conifer side of things, Western hemlock and Western red cedar are our two most shade tolerant conifers. In sort of the mid-story layer, we have vine maple, which is a very shade tolerant sort of deciduous tree. Cascara is actually another shade-tolerant deciduous tree that sort of grows very similarly to vine maple. Vine maple is one that I love to highlight because it gets these beautiful, like just array of colors during the fall time. And you can really almost track the season of fall by the changing of the vine maples, which I think is pretty cool. You also have salal, which is a shrub that, and ocean spray, which is another shrub that will grow pretty well in shady areas. And then ferns are going to be really a superstar when it comes to shady areas. They are very tolerant of living underneath canopies. I wanted to highlight sword fern, deer fern, and maidenhair fern. Maidenhair kind of almost looks like a beautiful fan. It's sort of this middle picture next to the vine maple. And then we also have wild ginger. This is one that is a super cool species. And if you are really into the pollinators that don't get a lot of love and attention, wild ginger is a great one to incorporate into your yard because it's actually pollinated by ants. It has these, it's either ants or flies. Someone will have to fact check me on that. But nevertheless, it has these really interesting flower shapes that are very low to the ground and that allows for those pollinators to get up in there and transport that pollen. And it has these beautiful leaves and it's a great ground cover. And we've already touched a little bit on Pacific bleeding heart as being a great shade tolerant species. For folks who are living on Camano Island, I always like to highlight some species that are great for slopes and bluffs. I'll focus mainly just on trees and shrubs. For some of our hardwoods, we have Pacific madrone. This is a super resilient tree that is really great at spreading its roots both deep into the ground but also laterally as well, and it can grow over rocky and sandy soil. It's evergreen again, so it's going to provide some of that year-round beauty with its beautiful red bark. We have willows. They are going to prefer moist soils, but they are just really fast growing and they have these relatively deep and very fibrous root systems. So they're great ones that if you need to get some trees established fast, these are going to be great options. In terms of conifers, Douglas fir and shore pine, specifically shore pine, is a really great conifer to incorporate onto your slopes and bluffs. It's great at rooting down, and shore pine specifically is very tolerant of like the dry and rocky soils that might be present on slopes and bluffs. Something to consider too is that shore pine is very tolerant to salt spray and wind, which is another thing that might be experienced more so, especially on bluffs. In terms of shrubs, we have twinberry. Twinberry is another one that is very fast growing and can get established pretty quickly and is again providing some of those delightful food resources. We have sword fern as well, very versatile and evergreen species that grows more laterally, but it has these really thick root systems and it spreads pretty easily as well. So if you get a couple in there, it's likely that it'll spread over time. Some other species that I want to highlight that are great also and are specifically tolerant to salt spray and wind is salal, evergreen huckleberry, Dole Oregon grape, and then kinnikinick as well. Shifting gears into thinking about how to bring water into your green space. So, as we all know, water is very essential for life, whether it's drinking, creating breeding areas, bathing, and then also just general habitat for certain species. Water is a really critical component to wildlife habitat that I think sometimes gets missed with folks a lot. But there's some pretty easy ways to incorporate it. You can go, more fancy and get a whole pond, but you can also be very simple and do something sort of like what these robins here are bathing in and just a pot upside down and a dish for them to get that water from. So a few things to note though as you're incorporating water into your green space, especially if you're using sort of these methods pictured here, is to have a dish that is going to have shallow sides and then use rocks or make sure that has a rough surface so that specifically insects don't get stuck in whatever vessel you're storing that water in. So you want to make sure that they have access to get in and out freely and aren't sort of drowning or, yeah, just getting stuck. If you have larger bodies of water, it's really good to think about circulation and incorporating some native vegetation because you're going to want to reduce the amount of algae that's growing and also just reducing the likelihood of that, pest insects like mosquitoes are going to sort of, be around that water area. And then really it's important to think a lot about where you're placing this water. So sometimes I'll see people have bird baths sort of like in the middle of their yard because they want it to be, easily viewable for them to enjoy, which is super understandable. But if you're placing it in the middle of the yard, then that's sort of putting, especially birds, sort of at risk for conflicts with other wildlife. So just being a little bit more strategic, placing those water resources next to shrubs or trees, just in an area where wildlife can easily sort of escape if, a conflict might occur with another species. So just sort of giving them those escape routes, but maybe you can still be strategic and position in an area that you can still enjoy it as well. Because we're talking about water, I also wanted to highlight some drought tolerant species. We've already talked about a few of these, but I'll run through them really quick. Douglas fir and shore pine are two conifers that I've already mentioned, very drought tolerant. We also have incense cedar, which is technically a non-native. It grows more in Northern California to Southern Oregon, but I've seen a huge increase in people bringing it sort of up into Washington and experimenting with some assisted migration. And I think that incorporating that into sort of your smaller yard, as opposed to like a landscape scale of planting incense cedar everywhere, is not a huge deal, pretty low risk rather. So incense cedar is a really great drought tolerant species. So I did want to highlight it, with the caveat that it's not technically native. We also have our chokecherry and also our bitter cherry, which is Prunus emerginata. We have Gary oak, which is probably my most favorite deciduous drought tolerant species. They're so beautiful. It's also our only native oak. Um, and just to bring in a little more context, like I mentioned, we're losing a lot of our meadow spaces due to urbanization, and a lot of those meadows are actually historically Gary oak meadows. So as we see this decrease in meadows, we're seeing a decrease in this very important food resource species for mammals, birds, and also a lot of the indigenous people in this area as well. So incorporating more Gary oaks into your space has sort of this cultural and then also ecological benefit. Truly one of my most favorite trees. In the shrub department, we have nine bark and red flowering currant, both very versatile and drought tolerant. We have kinnikinick, Oregon sunshine on sort of the ground cover region. Oregon sunshine is pictured here, these beautiful yellow flowers in the bottom. And then we have Romer's fescue, which is also pictured here, is a type of bunch grass, which is really great for insects to nest in. And then, like I mentioned, very drought tolerant. So great one to get established, especially if you're trying to move away from traditional lawns. And then I wanted to sort of round out this presentation just to think about how we can sort of bring humans into this conversation and think about ecological well-being outside of just wildlife and plants, but what is really the role of humans and how can we really support ecological well-being? And a quote comes to mind that I have uh, put here from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book Braiding Sweetgrass, that restoration is imperative for the health, for the healing of the earth, but reciprocity is imperative for the long-lasting, successful restoration. And I think this quote really reminds us that restoration isn't just about repairing damaged ecosystems, but it's really also about building reciprocal relationship with the land. And that when we are creating wildlife habitat in our own backyards and using native plants, we're really practicing this restoration on a small but a very meaningful scale. And native gardens offer so many benefits from the food, the shelter, the connectivity for local species. But they're also really inviting us humans to like pay attention to what's going on in our natural world and to care for the soil and to learn from what's going on in our very unique spaces and to invite other people into those spaces to enjoy it as well. So as we plant and water and steward these lands and support wildlife, I think in return we receive so much from clean air and healthier soils and pollination and just a much deeper sense of connection and well-being. So I love gardening with native plants, and I had to bring us all into it together and encourage you all to be more active partners and sort of healing a lot of our ecosystems and conserving areas. And just to choose species that are really engaging to both you and wildlife, I think is really just a great thing to think about. Moving a bit into the resources part of this presentation, I wanted to talk about where you can source native plants. King County has a really awesome native plant nurseries list. If you just look up King County native plant nurseries list, it'll pop up. Um, King Conservation District also has this great fact sheet that lists a lot of King County nurseries. I love that UW Native Plant Nursery is listed on here. That's the nursery I used to work at. I love that it gets a little shout out on this pamphlet. And then, of course, highlighting our annual plant sale. Our website, we have an amazing domain. It's called theplantsale.org. Check it out. At the bottom of the page of our website, you can sign up for our plant sale email so you can get the most up-to-date information about our plant sale. Pre-orders will begin early January in 2026. I am unfortunately not allowed to release the date of the pre-order yet, but in our very next Snohomish Conservation District newsletter, it will be announced. But I can tell you it is early January. We will be offering around 80 species. Actually, 80, we're waiting on two more confirmations from the nursery, so maybe 82 species, including 9 new ones. And so I really recommend just, yeah, checking out our website, browsing through to see what is going to be available. We have a tendency to sell out very fast. Our plant sale is one of my most favorite events of the entire year, but it is also a busy time, and people are on our website the moment it opens up at 9 a.m. To get plants. So if you are interested in purchasing plants for us, just be ready in that first week to lock in your orders. And I believe this year, if I'm not mistaken, we have a $20 order. It's either 20 or 25, pardon me, um, order minimum. So just to keep that in mind as well as you are making your purchases. And then I wanted to highlight the National Wildlife Federation. I feel like Val really covered the certified wildlife habitat process, but there's another really cool resource. It's called the Native Plant Finder. And it's one that I really like to direct people to because it's pretty cool. You can really get into the really specifics of finding native plants to really connect to very specific pollinators and your very specific region. So you can really match your space to the pollinators and native plants that you're trying to attract. It's a really great way to support also like endangered species or very rare plants as well, and then finding sort of the connection between those two. So that's just a resource I really want to highlight for you all. And then we really are just getting into my list of resource slides. All of these resources will be sent to you in an email, or for anyone who registered, will be sent to your email after the presentation. But just to highlight a few, for native plants, we have Washington Plant Society and the National Wildlife Federation are great places to start to learn more about native plants. There's a really great sort of fact sheet article called Shrubs and Trees for Bees through OSU, which is Oregon State University. Um, our conservation district fact sheets, I think, are always a great place to check some stuff out. I didn't get to talk a lot about rain gardens or wetlands today, but we have some great fact sheets on how to create those rain gardens and how to incorporate wetland plants and riparian species into your yard. And we also have fact sheets on things like bank stabilization as well, if folks have particular bank stabilization needs. If you are ever in need of help with invasive species, I really recommend reaching out to your local county. And then that's also something that the Snohomish Conservation District really focuses on. So if you are really struggling and need some assistance, whether that's technical assistance or just resources, you can put in a technical assistance request through Snohomish Conservation District and you'll be matched with one of our planners, potentially me, and I might be able to provide you some assistance. We also have the Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board, which is a great place to go to check sort of the classification of weeds and then get some best management practice information on how to control those invasive and non-native species. For resources on pollinators and wildlife, I just have to highlight right off the bat that the Xerces Society is a wonderful place to learn more about bees and pollinators. I also really love Heather Holmes' books on bees and pollinators as well. She's really a wonderful author and has just really accessible information. Her website is great. Um, and then these links here, you'll be able to actually click on through the email. I also have some information on in fact sheets rather for rain gardens, some more gardening tips, and then these King County landscape guides are the ones that I mentioned all the way back in the beginning of the presentation. Really do check those out. They're a great way to just, you know, not have just a blank slate to look at. They just sort of have these pre-made guides that can be a really just great starting point for people, especially if you have never really delved into the art of landscaping. These are really just great things to check out and hopefully make that a little more accessible for you. And then my final few resources are just a little bit more fun. So I have this USGS survey that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation and habitat connectivity if you'd like to read more about that. And then I also mentioned some information about pollinators and the economic sort of services that they're providing in terms of supporting our food systems. That link goes to that article if you want to read more. And then I have two documentaries linked here. One is called The Wild Ways from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, focused also on salmon, and then the Salmon Forest documentary, which is focused on the Tongass National Forest, which is in Alaska. It's a really cool documentary and just really makes you think a lot about the interaction between, the terrestrial forest and riparian area, but then also what's happening in our waterways, and the salmon that live there. So I think that's a really cool documentary. Both of those are free to watch as well. And then finally, I would just love to thank, especially Roxy and Val for having us tonight, but the Camano Wildlife Habitat Project. Sorry, my got a little skewed here. The picture is covering part of your title, but I just really appreciate all of your coordination and having me here tonight. And then thank you to the district for, paying for me to be here, and then to the county and Conservation Commission for all of their support as well. So thank you. I will maybe pass it back to Val if we want to do some questions.
So feel free to unmute. I've just turned that on so you can unmute and ask your questions verbally, or you can type them in the chat room. I have one, Paisley, off the top of your head, do you know what the new plants are that you're going to have this year?
Oh, that's a great question. The new plans. So we did some adjustments. We've got some feedback about things like Oregon ash, for example, because we have seen sort of a rise in emerald ash borer sort of in there. So we took that off. Sorry, I'm not answering your question right off the bat.
That's fine. That's
Um,
fine. Just talk
but
about the sale. That's great.
Yeah, yeah, just talking about the sale exactly. Let's see. We have incorporated a few new sort of understory species. Piggyback plant is one of them, which is a great little ground cover, very shade tolerant. We also have goldenrod bare roots this year, which is exciting. I think
Oh,
last year we only had them available as seeds, if I remember correctly.
ah,
Um, so yeah, we've just been doing a little bit of refining, taking out also last year we offered incense cedar, but we just again got some feedback about wanting to really focus more on native species. So I don't think that's one that we'll be offering this year. Um, Let me just pull up if there's any more questions, I'll pull up my list right here, and see if I can't think of a few more for you all to share.
so I'm sorry I was late getting she sent me the resource links for the resources she mentioned. It's on the website now, and I also put a link in the chat. And it will, as she said, it will come out via email, but um, those are good places to check. So another question about the sale. It used to be that you would have packages, everything was packed in like groups of 10 or 15. And then recently you've just been doing it in smaller groups, like one or three. What's going to be this year?
That's a great question. Yeah, so we are going to be doing all bundles of 5 this year.
Okay.
And it'll be laid out sort of on the plant sale website as well. When you click on a species, there'll be information about the bundle sizes. Um, the maybe only exception to that is some of our super small sort of species. And we have a greenhouse here at the district that supports our plant sale. And sometimes those smaller plugs we sell in lower quantities. But for all of our bare roots and all of our live stakes, those will be sold in bundles of 5.
Okay.
Mhm.
That makes it easier. Sometimes you don't want 10 or 15.
Yes, very
Yeah.
true. Very
Okay.
true. Yeah. Oh, I did let's see. I'm just trying to pull up the list of the plants this year, but it's very buried in my file. So if there
That's
are more
fine.
questions coming in,
Yeah,
I'll
it's
keep
easy
looking
for
for
people to
this.
pull those up.
That's true. Yeah.
Mary Alice has had her hand up for a while there. Mary Alice, do you have a question? The hand is up. I was wondering.
Yeah, sometimes that's just easy to hit by mistake, but
Okay.
yeah, she may have had a question early on.
Nope, no question. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, Oh, I'll stop sharing for a moment.
No
Okay,
questions?
no
Well,
worries.
thank you for
Well,
all for
there's
coming.
just a comment.
Yeah.
First off, Paisley,
Oh,
this was a great program. Kudos to you
yeah.
Thank
and
you.
your enthusiasm. And I liked your ecological well-being with the
Yeah.
that you put in at the end, and all the resources. So well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I hope I wasn't talking too fast. I can really get on a roll sometimes. But I know this is recorded, so
Yeah.
hopefully it'll be accessible for folks.
And I just want to say about the red flowering currants, I have a lot of them because I love them so much. And
Hmm.
I have also have a lot of deer, but I have not had any problem with deer chewing mine down.
Oh, great to
So I
know.
don't know. I would expect now that somebody mentioned that, I would think that it would be something they would like because it's sweet and whatever, but I haven't had a problem with that. So I would
Yeah.
encourage you to plant red flowering currants. I think they're marvelous plants.
Oh, I do too. And we will be offering those at our plant sale as well, which is exciting.
And I actually have some volunteers, so if anybody wants some free, just send email to Camino Wildlife Habitat. I'd be happy to share my volunteers. They're not invasive, they're not a nuisance, but the birds love them and eat the seeds and then I think spread them around.
That's exciting.
Well, and I just wanted to say something in support of messy gardens, because you can have yard art. But when you showed the meadow and then you showed the where the people could had their bee, their bee straws and such.
Oh,
But
yes.
if people just kind of leave the stems that are hollow, then that's all supported by nature to have places for those bees to put there, so messy gardens and allowing, tall grasses die down, but the stems are still there. That's providing for wildlife habitat.
That's true. Very true. Yeah, especially species like, for example, red elderberry has those hollow stems that are really great for bees.
Yeah.
And I think I see one question in the chat about how long to leave goldenrod before pruning it or cutting it down. Um, I would say it depends on your goal. You could never cut it down if you'd like, and just let it sort of self-seed and keep going if you're okay with that level of messiness. Um, but if you do want to sort of eliminate some of that bushiness effect, I guess, you could trim, I would say maybe mid-June, so like late spring, early summer, um, if you're trying to avoid some of that flopping or that bushiness. Yeah, so maybe springtime.
Barbara, did you have a question? You had a
Um,
hand raised.
I was just going to make a comment talking about deer resistance. One thing the deer love is osoberry. I usually have extra of it just so they can browse on it, but that's one of their very favorite browse
Interesting.
foods.
Hmm.
Huh.
Yeah, I have
That's sort of
also
just the
experienced that.
reverse.
Yeah, one thing of great
Yeah.
about osoberry though is that the deer definitely do browse on it, but it will re-sprout, which is exciting. So,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
one thing that's
It
great
just
about a lot of
keeps,
our native species is that even as they are getting sort of maybe pruned by the
Yeah.
deer or browsed on them,
mm,
they have this really wonderful ability to re-sprout and get multiple stems, and that does create more of a bushy effect. So if that's not your desired goal, that could be a problem. Yeah,
Right.
I just figure I'm feeding the deer.
Yeah.
yeah, that's very
Yeah.
kind of you.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and thank you especially Paisley. This is a marvelous, marvelous talk. Very inspiring, and I'm anxious to go look up some of those new studies you mentioned. There's some very fascinating research going on these days.
There really is, and I'm always trying to stay, up to date and,
Yeah.
sharing important information. So if you also have any, please send them my way. I would love to
Okay.
hear about them.
Great. Well, thank you. All
Yeah,
righty.
thank you
Well,
all. Have a good night.
good night.
Thank you so much.